September 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. A German prisoner stepped off the transport truck and looked down at his wrists. No shackles, no chains. Just the autumn dust settling on his bare skin and the eyes of a single-armed guard watching from 10 yards away. He had prepared himself for brutality, for the kind of treatment he had seen inflicted on Soviet prisoners back home. Instead, he found himself walking toward the camp gates with nothing but a number stenciled on his uniform and a strange, unsettling sense of freedom. Before we go further, if you're finding this story as gripping as we do, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you these untold moments from history every week. And drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, back to September 1943. The walk into town came 2 weeks later. The prisoner, a former Afrika Korps corporal named Klaus, had expected to be paraded through hostile streets, maybe pelted with stones or spit. He had seen the propaganda films. America was supposed to be a land of gangsters and chaos, a nation tearing itself apart. But as the escort detail led his group down Main Street, past the hardware store and the diner with its neon sign flickering in the afternoon heat, Klaus felt something shift inside him. The street was clean. The people looked well-fed. Children played on the sidewalk. And in that moment, staring at a shop window filled with canned goods and fresh bread, he realized that everything he had been told was a lie. The men who arrived on American soil in 1943 came from the deserts of Tunisia, the hills of Sicily, the burned-out towns of southern Italy. They had fought under Rommel, endured the collapse of the Afrika Korps, and watched as the Allies closed in on Fortress Europe. Nearly 150,000 Axis soldiers were captured in North Africa alone between May and June of that year. The British camps were overflowing, and the decision was made to ship tens of thousands across the Atlantic. The voyages were long and tense, with U-boats still prowling the shipping lanes, but the convoys made it through. By the fall of 1943, German prisoners were arriving at ports in New York and New Jersey by the thousands. What awaited them was not the nightmare they had imagined. Processing centers like Camp Shanks and Fort Dix operated with bureaucratic efficiency. The prisoners were fingerprinted, photographed, and issued uniforms marked with large black PW letters. They were given medical examinations, hot meals, and bedding. The Geneva Convention of 1929 outlined specific protections for prisoners of war, and the United States military adhered to those rules with meticulous care. For soldiers who had braced themselves for cruelty, this was the first shock. They were being treated like human beings. Klaus remembered the train ride inland. The rail cars were not cattle cars. They had seats. Through the windows, he watched the American heartland roll past. Endless fields of corn and wheat. Small towns with church steeples and water towers. Farms that stretched to the horizon. He had grown up on a farm in Bavaria, but nothing there compared to the scale of what he was seeing now. The mechanization alone was staggering. Tractors, combines, silos that looked like factories. Germany had always prided itself on efficiency, but this was something else entirely. This was abundance. By the time Klaus arrived at Camp Hearn in central Texas, he had begun to understand that his captivity would be unlike anything he had anticipated. The camp itself resembled a small town. Rows of wooden barracks, a mess hall, a chapel, even a canteen where prisoners could purchase soap and cigarettes with the modest pay they earned from work details. The fences were there, of course, but they were not electrified. The guard towers were manned, but not heavily. The entire system seemed designed around the assumption that the prisoners would follow the rules. And for the most part, they did. The work began within days. The War Manpower Commission had authorized the use of prisoner labor across the country, and the demand was overwhelming. Millions of American men were overseas, and the farms and factories that fed the war effort were desperate for hands. Klaus and his fellow prisoners were loaded onto trucks each morning and driven out to cotton fields, sugar beet farms, and orchards. The guards accompanied them, rifles slung over their shoulders, but there were no chains, no handcuffs, just the expectation that the men would work and that they would return to camp at the end of the day. Klaus found himself picking cotton alongside a dozen other Germans under the supervision of a single American soldier. The guard was young, maybe 19, and he spent most of his time leaning against the truck, smoking and reading a magazine. The prisoners talked among themselves, speculating about when the war would end, about what was happening back home. Some of them joked that they were safer here than they would have been on the Eastern Front. Others stayed quiet, still processing the strangeness of it all. The work was hard, but it was honest, and at the end of the week they were paid in canteen scrip that they could use to buy small luxuries. It was a far cry from the forced labor camps they had heard about in occupied Europe. The first escorted visit into town came in late October. Klaus and 20 other prisoners were loaded onto a bus and driven into a nearby community for a work detail at a grain elevator. As they passed through the streets, Klaus pressed his face to the window and stared. The town looked like something out of a film. Clean sidewalks, painted storefronts, cars parked along the curbs. He saw a woman pushing a baby carriage, a man in overalls loading supplies into a pickup truck, a group of boys playing baseball in an empty lot. There were no bomb craters, no rubble, no signs of war at all. When the bus stopped and the prisoners were led off, Klaus expected hostility. He expected anger. Instead, he was met with curiosity. A few townspeople stopped to watch, but no one shouted. No one threw anything. An older man nodded at one of the guards and asked how the harvest was going. A woman walking past glanced at Klaus and then looked away, her expression neutral. It was as if the presence of enemy soldiers on American soil was just another part of the routine. Klaus found that more unsettling than any confrontation would have been. The work at the grain elevator lasted most of the afternoon. The prisoners hauled sacks of wheat and oats, loaded trucks, and swept the floors. During a break, Klaus was allowed to sit on the loading dock with a cup of water. From where he sat, he could see down the main street. A diner with a Coca-Cola sign in the window, a movie theater advertising a John Wayne picture, a hardware store with a display of tools in the front window. Everything looked prosperous, everything looked normal. And for the first time since his capture, Klaus felt the full weight of what that meant. Germany was losing, not just tactically, but structurally. The nation he had fought for could never match this. The absence of chains became a recurring theme in the letters Klaus wrote home. The censors allowed prisoners to send mail several times a month, and Klaus used those letters to process what he was experiencing. He wrote carefully, knowing that every word would be read by American officers before being sent overseas. But even with that constraint, he could not hide his astonishment. He described the abundance, the civility, the strange trust that allowed him to walk through towns with nothing but a guard watching from a distance. He knew his family would struggle to believe him. By late 1943, Germany was enduring constant bombing raids and severe rationing. The idea that enemy prisoners were walking freely through American streets, past shops filled with goods, would sound like fantasy. One letter, preserved in a family archive and later translated by historians, read, "We are treated not as animals, but as men. They take us into their towns, and we walk without chains. The people do not hate us. They simply watch. I do not understand it, but I am grateful." Other prisoners wrote similar accounts. A soldier from Hamburg described being allowed to attend a church service under escort, calling it the most human thing he had experienced since leaving Europe. A farmhand from Saxony noted that American guards sometimes shared cigarettes with the prisoners during breaks, a small gesture that would have been unthinkable under the SS. The letters painted a consistent picture. Captivity in the United States was not what Nazi propaganda had promised. It was something far stranger and, in many ways, far more destabilizing. The work details continued through the winter. Klaus and his group were sent to different farms and towns, each visit reinforcing the same pattern. No chains, minimal guards, a level of trust that felt almost reckless. In December, they were taken to a lumber mill in East Texas. In January, they helped repair roads damaged by heavy rains. In February, they returned to the cotton fields to prepare for the spring planting, and with each outing, Klaus absorbed more details. The cars that filled the streets, still running smoothly despite the war. The music that drifted from open windows, big band sounds and crooners he had never heard before. The casual ease with which American civilians went about their lives, as if the war were happening on another planet. The guards themselves became part of the education. Most were young men, drafted but assigned to stateside duty because of injury or other disqualifications for combat. They were not brutal. They were not cruel. They were bored. Klaus watched as one guard spent an entire afternoon teaching a group of prisoners how to play poker. Another shared photos of his girlfriend back in Ohio and asked the Germans about their families. It was not friendship exactly, but it was far from the enmity Klaus had expected. The Americans seemed to view their role as a job, nothing more. They enforced the rules, but they did not go out of their way to humiliate or degrade. By the spring of 1944, Klaus had been in captivity for nearly a year. He had picked cotton, hauled grain, repaired fences, and walked through more American towns than he could count. And he had done it all without chains. That simple fact, more than anything else, stayed with him. It was not just a matter of physical comfort. It was symbolic. It suggested a kind of confidence that the Third Reich had never possessed. The Americans did not need to shackle their enemies because they did not fear them. They had the land, the resources, and the industrial might to absorb an entire army of prisoners without breaking stride. The war in Europe ground on. D-Day came and went. The Allies pushed deeper into France, then into Belgium and the Netherlands. Back in Camp Herne, the prisoners listened to news broadcasts and read censored newspapers trying to piece together what was happening. Some clung to hope that Germany could still turn the tide. Others, like Klaus, had already accepted the inevitable. The contrast between what they saw in America and what they knew of conditions back home made it impossible to believe otherwise. Germany was running out of fuel, food, and men. America had all three in overwhelming abundance. In the fall of 1944, Klaus was part of a work detail sent to a farm near Waco. The farmer, an older man with a limp from the First World War, treated the prisoners with businesslike courtesy. He showed them what needed to be done, provided tools, and then left them to work under the supervision of a single guard. At the end of the day, the farmer brought out sandwiches and cold milk. He did not say much, but he nodded his thanks. Klaus stood there, holding a sandwich made with fresh bread and real butter, and thought about the ration cards and empty shelves back home. The gulf between the two realities was too vast to comprehend. The letters continued. Klaus wrote to his younger brother, who was still serving on the Eastern Front. He tried to explain what captivity in America was like, but he knew the words would sound hollow. How could he describe walking through a town without chains when his brother was fighting for his life in the snow outside Leningrad? How could he talk about abundance when his family was struggling to find bread? The disconnect haunted him. He was safe, fed, and treated with a dignity he had not expected, and yet the war raged on, and his country was being destroyed. By the spring of 1945, the end was near. The Allies crossed the Rhine. Berlin fell. Hitler died in his bunker, and in camps across the United States, German prisoners learned that the war was over. For Klaus, the news brought a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that the killing had stopped. Dread at the thought of what awaited him when he returned home. He had heard rumors of the devastation, the bombed cities, the Soviet occupation zones, the starvation. He knew that the Germany he had left no longer existed. Repatriation began in 1946. Klaus and thousands of other prisoners were transported back to Europe on crowded ships. The voyage was long and uncomfortable, but Klaus spent most of it thinking about the 2 years he had spent in Texas. The work, the towns, the absence of chains. It all seemed unreal now, like a dream he had briefly inhabited before waking to the nightmare of post-war Europe. When the ship finally docked in France, and Klaus was transferred to a British holding camp before being released, he felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. He was going home to a country in ruins, carrying memories of a place where captivity had felt more free than life under the regime he had once served. Years later, in interviews conducted by historians in the 1980s, Klaus would describe those years in America as the turning point of his life. He spoke of the shock of seeing a nation so prosperous that it could afford to treat its enemies with dignity. He talked about the farmers who had thanked him for his work, the guards who had shared cigarettes, the towns that had allowed him to walk through their streets without chains. And he spoke of the realization that had come to him slowly, over months of labor and observation, that the war had been lost not just on the battlefield, but in the fundamental mismatch between two societies, one built on coercion and fear, the other on trust and abundance. The memories stayed with him. In the decades that followed, Klaus became a teacher in West Germany, and he often told his students about his time as a prisoner in America. He did not romanticize it. He did not pretend that captivity had been easy or that the fear and uncertainty had vanished overnight. There were nights when he still woke to the sound of distant engines or the imagined rattle of a camp gate closing. Yet, despite the hardship, he emphasized the lesson he had learned, that even in war, there were choices about how to treat the defeated, and that those choices carried consequences far beyond the battlefield, echoing in ways that could shape the future long after the guns had gone silent. The story of German prisoners walking American streets without chains is not just a footnote in the history of the Second World War. It is a reflection of two very different philosophies of power and humanity. One that believed control came from chains, fear, and intimidation, and another that believed order could be maintained through structure, law, and a quiet confidence in human dignity. For the men who lived through it, that difference was impossible to forget. It defined how they saw authority, justice, and even forgiveness. And for the generations that followed, it became part of the larger narrative of why the war ended the way it did, and why some wounds healed while others did not. Klaus returned to his family's farm in Bavaria in late 1946. The house was still standing, though time and war had scarred it. The fields lay overgrown with weeds, and the barn bore deep wounds from shelling and fire. His mother wept when she saw him, clutching him as if afraid he might vanish once more into the chaos that had already taken so much. His younger brother had not come home, lost somewhere on the vast Eastern Front. The silence of that absence lingered, heavy and unspoken, shaping every mealtime and every quiet evening. In the years that followed, Klaus worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been broken. He repaired the barn beam by beam, restored the house stone by stone, and tilled the stubborn soil until it gave life again. He married a local girl, kind and patient, and together they raised children who grew up among the same hills and rivers that had shaped him. Seasons passed, and life slowly returned to the quiet valley. Birds sang again in the orchard. The wind whispered softly through the tall grass. Yet Klaus never stopped thinking about those long walks through Texas towns during his captivity. He remembered being unshackled and free beneath the wide, endless sky. He never forgot the strange kindness of his captors, men who had once been his enemies but had treated him with unexpected decency. He remembered the quiet dignity of being trusted, even when trust seemed impossible. In every classroom where he stood, and in every story he told to his children and later to their children, that memory endured. It was proof that mercy, once given freely, holds a strength all its own. Its power endures long after the moment has passed, reminding every listener that kindness can survive even in war,